Welcome back to today's video. In today's video, we are going to go over some very interesting arm immobilization studies that present some potential opportunities for how we approach arm rehabilitation after a neurologic injury. In this video, you're going to learn why the arm stops moving after a neurologic injury, some of the barriers that interfere with restoring arm movement after a neurologic injury, and how we might use this information to totally transform how we structure an arm rehab program to optimize neuroplasticity, or that brain rewiring after a stroke. If you're new to this channel, I'm Tara, I'm a neurologic physical therapist, and on this channel we talk about anything and everything related to mobility, health, fitness, and mindset with the end goal of empowering you with as many tools as possible to take full ownership of your rehab. And today's video hits on everything that this channel is about, which is finding maybe new or novel ways of approaching rehabilitation after a neurologic injury to take you from where you're at today and push you to that next level. Throughout this video, I'm going to be referencing a paper. That paper is linked in the video description. So if you find this topic interesting and you want to read the full article for yourself, link is in the description below. So before we get into the potential opportunities for how we can transform arm rehabilitation after a stroke, as usual, I'm going to give a little bit of background or history so that we're all on the same page, highlighting some of the most important information or theories that we know up to this point that influence arm rehabilitation, or really neuroplasticity in general after a stroke. And it all begins with what happens when you have a stroke. So when someone has a stroke or damage to one side of their brain, which can occur also after a brain injury or maybe even an MS lesion, what happens is you lose a neural connection, or you lose something in the hard drive that controls upper extremity movement. When this happens, you lose very valuable voluntary motor control of your arm if an arm area of the brain was involved. So what is the goal of most neuro rehab clinicians after a neurologic injury, or really therapists? Neuroplasticity. Now, you guys hear me talk a lot about this on the channel, but it's always good to just define what this means in the context of neurologic rehabilitation after a stroke or a brain injury. Neuroplasticity in this context is how the brain rewires or reorganizes when it's presented with new experiences after your neurologic injury. So in rehab, what do? We give you a task, or we challenge you with a new task post-injury, with the goal of retraining the brain or challenging the brain to build a new neural network that doesn't involve that damaged area of the brain. Now, we know there are 3 times in life when the brain is the most ripe or optimized for getting this neuroplasticity in the brain to occur. One is during the very, very early stage of life, when we're learning those critical mobility skills, rolling, crawling, standing, walking. And then again, in those school years, when we're learning a lot of information, those are pretty much obvious. But then there's a third time when the brain is ripe for this neuroplasticity that we know for sure happens, and that is after some sort of trauma or event to the brain, i.e. a stroke or a brain injury. So for any of you that have been told that your brain does not rewire in adulthood, especially after any type of a neurologic injury, absolutely not true. Anyone who tells you that is basing that on really old information. Newer imaging techniques and multiple studies have repeatedly proven that this is not true, that our brains do rewire well into adulthood and even late adulthood. Prime example is how our grandparents and our parents even sometimes are learning how to use AI and computers, and for some of our grandparents learning to use a cell phone for the first time. The brain is rewiring. So that's a real world example of where we see this occurring. But despite those obvious examples, we know that the brain is extremely ripe, or sets itself back up for rewiring to occur anytime there's trauma. But here's the little caveat that creates a little wrinkle in this smooth piece of fabric, and that is there's positive or adaptive neuroplasticity, and there's maladaptive neuroplasticity. Now, there are real world examples of this occurring. An adaptive neuroplasticity example would be when you learned how to drive a car. Initially, you needed to pay attention to everything. You need to look at the shifter to know what letter to go into for what gear you wanted to put the car in. Over time, you no longer needed to look at the shifter and you could just automatically do that. Same with the blinkers and all the functions of a car, they become automatic. The first time you drive somewhere, you're pulling out your Google Maps, you're following along, making sure that you get all the turns at the correct lights or the stop signs. Eventually you drive that route enough times, it becomes automatic where you're not even thinking about it. Those are examples of positive neuroplasticity or adaptive neuroplasticity. A real world example, kind of maladaptive neuroplasticity would be you sit at a computer all day hunched over, you do that for several days. Over time of repetitively sitting in that position, now you notice you're maintaining bad posture when you do a ton of other skills. Walking, going to the grocery store, watching TV. That's an example of maladaptive neuroplasticity. You did something repetitively that now is having suboptimal impacts on your day-to-day life. This also occurs after a neurologic injury. There is what I term positive neuroplasticity, and there is negative neuroplasticity. Now, what does this mean if we zoom back out big picture? It means that arm movement is impacted not only by events going on inside the brain, but also by the behaviors that we adopt immediately following that event. An example of positive neuroplasticity would be that you restore normal arm movement in your involved arm. Initially, when you have a stroke, if your arm is involved, the arm doesn't move. Over time, you start automatically using that arm again for your day-to-day life. An example of potentially maladaptive neuroplasticity is you forget you have this involved arm and you start doing everything with your uninvolved arm. That would be an example of a maladaptive neuroplasticity. What are our goals for physical therapy? And I promise you this will all tie together. Just follow along here because the whole intent of this video is to explain that there potentially are new models that could be rolled out in your neuro rehab centers that could upgrade your current arm rehabilitation. But what are our main goals in physical therapy or occupational therapy or really speech therapy? But I'm going to stick with the movement related therapies. One goal is to do whatever we can, present you with those novel activities that will get that brain to rewire. The goal is present you with activities that promote adaptive neuroplasticity, getting that involved arm to move without or minimizing residual or spared function. Now, why is that? Just like a kid in a candy store, if we highlight too much of being able to utilize residual movement, i.e. spared movement or movement that wasn't impacted by the stroke, your brain is going to latch onto that like a kid to candy, and you're going to just go in that direction. Your brain is just going to kind of go in that direction and try and build neural networks around that. So our goal as therapists is to promote adaptive neuroplasticity while being mindful to use residual movement as little as possible, i.e. the uninvolved arm in this case. And how do we do that? Now, some of this terminology I'm pulling from the article. Again, article is linked in the description below. How do we do that? Well, there's two theories that we base a lot of our decision making on when it comes to selecting the right activities. One is reactivation, and the other one is rebalancing. Reactivation is doing whatever we can to promote activity on the injured side of the brain. So we present you with some sort of task-specific activity. with the involved arm. And the goal is that stimulating something to occur, in this case, what we call axon sprouting, or where neurons in preserved areas of the brain kind of sprout new legs and take over for damaged areas of the brain in the same hemisphere of the brain, what we call ipsilateral sprouting, versus contralateral axon sprouting, which is going across hemispheres. So we present you with something where your involved arm has to do the work, and we get that ipsilateral sprouting. And the other one is rebalancing theories. Now, before we talk about rebalancing theories, we need to talk a little bit about what an imbalance is. An imbalance is when, as I mentioned earlier, the exact example of maladaptive neuroplasticity, we have you do things with your intact arm, the arm not impacted by the stroke. And to keep things simple, the more you do that, the repetition, that side of the brain, the uninjured side of the brain, starts to take over or dominate and inhibits the involved side of the brain. So you use your non-injured arm every single day to eat, brush your hair, get dressed, do everything with that hand. And our brains are extremely adaptive. And so what it tends to do is the undamaged side of the brain says, we got a lot of spare neurons over here. Let's just kind of sprout legs and kind of help out over on the uninjured side. And what ends up happening is that inhibits some of that ipsilateral axon sprouting from occurring. So that's an imbalance. Treatments that are based on kind of rebalancing, meaning not allowing the brain to get out of balance or bring it into balance where both hemispheres are doing work, or you're getting more of that axon sprouting on the ipsilateral hemisphere or the involved side of the brain, are brain stimulation techniques. Brain stimulation theories are brain stimulation therapies are where they put electrodes on the outside of the brain that stimulates the involved hemisphere or the damaged side of the brain and down regulates the uninjured side of the brain, or rebalances the two hemispheres. Another example of a rebalancing therapy would be mirror therapy. With mirror therapy, what you do is you put the uninvolved arm in front of a mirror or next to a mirror, and you do hand movements with the uninvolved arm. Your brain sees the uninvolved arm's reflection in the mirror, and that stimulates the involved side of the brain. I call it kind of tricking the brain into thinking that the involved arm is working. So mirror therapy is another rebalancing theory. And I promise you, all of this is going to make sense when we get to some potential opportunities for the direction of where neurologic rehabilitation could go as far as arm rehab. Constraint-induced therapy is another rebalancing therapy, or is a therapy that's based on rebalancing theory. So with constraint-induced therapy, and this is kind of what I hinted to in the very first statement I made in this video, is we immobilize the uninvolved arm, and they have done tons of studies on this and been able to repeat the results that what this does is it does kind of, you get more activity on the involved hemisphere. So by immobilizing the uninvolved arm, you're kind of turning the volume down on the uninjured side of the brain, giving the injured side of the brain an opportunity to kind of join the game. All of that said, we've got rebalancing, we've got reactivation. Most therapy interventions currently that we do really focus on the reactivation theory. And again, that involves presenting activities to the involved arm, facilitating the involved arm participating in those activities, and getting that ipsilateral sprouting, getting axonal sprouting on the involved hemisphere. Now, there's a huge downside to this, and that is that in order to do that, someone has to have some sort of movement in the involved arm, which immediately excludes a ton of people. So reactivation is helpful, but many of the techniques or interventions are not possible either in the early stages of arm rehabilitation or for those of you that have like a lot of tone or spasticity and don't have any functional movement in that arm. Interesting little tangent before we get into how we've used some of the literature on immobilizing the uninvolved side of the arm as we look at potential new models for neuroplasticity for arm rehabilitation post-stroke. In this paper, the authors also looked at what happens when we immobilize an involved arm. So what they did is they immobilized an involved arm in both people that have had a stroke and healthy individuals. And what they saw were some of the brain changes that occurred afterwards, whether the person had had a stroke or whether the person was healthy, the same kind of repercussions happened inside the brain. So the behavioral limitation of not being able to move the arm down regulates the hemisphere of the brain that it controls that arm, regardless of whether or not someone has had a stroke or someone is healthy. So why are they bringing this into this article? Is this article is really just presenting the idea of, are we doing everything we can to help people in those very, very early stages of arm rehabilitation or the people that have limited or no arm movement? And is it possible, could we potentially use even healthy individuals to do future research on what potential therapies might be possible? And I love this idea because means that you could do much larger scale studies. So just a little side note, probably nothing that really matters to any of you, but the interesting part was that for those of you that have had a stroke is that even when you take a healthy person and you immobilize one arm and you only have them use one arm, there are maladaptive consequences in the brain. Moral of that story, don't immobilize an arm at all costs. Now, I'm currently working with someone that recently fell and broke her involved arm, and the medical team decided to go with non-surgical management, which means she's going to be in a sling for 6 weeks. I am not a medical doctor. I know there's pros and cons to doing surgery, and it is something that I see quite frequently because falls are quite common after a stroke. And in most cases, someone does fracture their involved arm, obviously, because they have no protective responses on that side of the body. So it's kind of like dead weight just falling on that arm. And the most common treatment is non-surgical management, i.e. putting someone in a sling for 6 weeks, which was the case with someone that I worked with this week. Super detrimental to someone's recovery. Now, again, I'm not a doctor, so there are definitely consequences or risks associated with having surgery, especially someone who has a history of stroke. So I don't really know what the answer is, but reading this paper just further just kind of gives me a heaviness in my heart when we know that even if you take a healthy person and you mobilize their arm, they have some down regulation of activity on that side of the brain. But that's beside the point. The point of telling that story is that it was part of this article, and I found it very interesting that our behaviors post-stroke really have a dramatic impact on that neuroplasticity or adaptive brain rewiring after a neurologic injury. So, but now kind of back to this paper, if reactivation theories are not ideal for post-stroke rehab for someone who has little to no functional arm movement, then we look at that category of rebalancing theories. Are there ways to take some of that rebalancing theory and use some of those therapies that might be more beneficial to optimizing rehab or recovery or neural rewiring for someone that has little to no arm movement? So with any therapy or combination of therapies that want to utilize this rebalancing theory, the goals would be to promote positive or adaptive neuroplasticity, inhibit or downregulate activity on the uninvolved side of the brain, and do anything possible to activate activity on the involved side of the brain. So what are some ways that we can do this? Well, one is mental imagery, and we know this works. I've done a couple of videos on this. There's plenty of evidence where they have repeated the results where if someone does mental imagery, meaning visualizes themselves performing a specific movement over and over and over again, you get more activity on the involved side of the brain. They also highlighted studies where they've done this where people watch someone on video doing an activity, an arm movement or a leg movement. And again, you do get some more activity on that involved side of the brain, or you get less activity or you inhibit some of that activity on the uninvolved side of the brain, rebalancing. They know that E-stem does this. In my opinion, of course, I'm going to interject a couple of times of things that the paper didn't really highlight, but things that I think are important based on what I see clinically. E-stem works to a point. If you're using it too much, you build up a tolerance to it. But the main theory of, or the main kind of mechanism of E-stem is not what most people think, which most people think you see your arm move, you think that you're like that Rocky movie where they hooked the electrodes up to someone's stomach and that person like turned into Rocky, you know, had hard abs. That's not really how E-stem works. What E-stem does is it stimulates sensory parts of the brain. So you know that little tingling you feel? That is stimulating or it's activating sensory areas of the brain that perceive that sensation on your skin, which you get like a reaction to that. So indirectly, you're getting an involuntary movement. I want to be clear, it's still involuntary. If you don't believe me, ask anyone that's gone to PT school. In our downtime, we always thought it was fun to kind of put those electrodes on ourselves and watch our hand contort into all these positions that we couldn't get out of. It's completely involuntary. But what it does is it provides a positive feedback loop. And based on what this paper is saying, is it kind of upregulates that involved hemisphere of the brain and inhibits that overactivation or overactivity in the uninvolved side of the brain. And then, of course, the brain stimulation, which I mentioned earlier. There's RTMS, which is repetitive transcutaneous magnetic stimulation. And then there's TDCS, which is transcutaneous direct current stimulation. And both of these techniques involve putting electrodes on the skull, stimulating that involved side of the brain, inhibiting that uninvolved side of the brain, or rebalancing. In my experience, brain stimulation therapies in and of themselves, I haven't seen great results, and the evidence actually supports that. Now, of course, I don't always put all my eggs in the basket of what someone can show in a research study, especially after a stroke, because the studies are mostly very, very small because it's very hard to find people that have all had similar areas of the brain impacted by their stroke and keeping someone in a study for a long period of time. So those techniques or therapies by themselves, I can't say that clinically I've seen them be very effective, but also that's what the research suggests. And really that's the case also with the E-stem. Once that E-stem is removed, a lot of times there isn't great carryover for whatever movement was able to happen while that E-stem was on. And mental imagery, great to a certain extent, but in and of itself, again, not showing great results, especially for those in those early stages. So one thing or one opportunity that this article, again linked below, presented was, what if we did combination of therapies? And this is where I think there's a real missed opportunity by all of us clinicians, is we live in these silos of this one treatment either works or it doesn't work. This one treatment either works or it doesn't work. And what this paper looked at was, what if you did combination of therapies? For example, what if you did mental imagery with E-stem, which is super easy to do because most of us clinicians, we are doing E-stem, and we probably very often do a little bit of mental imagery with our patients. But what if we put them together and they do think that this is an opportunity that we are missing in therapy, i.e., there have been some good results when you combine these two therapies, again, to rebalance, promote adaptive neuroplasticity, inhibit the uninvolved side of the brain. So for those of you that are already doing E-stem, you hear me talk quite frequently on this channel that you absolutely should not be doing e-stim without doing it in the context of some task-specific training. But I would challenge you to go a step further based on this article and throw in some mental imagery. So occasionally maybe be working on some sort of task-specific training, but if you're in those very early stages and there's really nothing functional you can do with that arm, maybe visualize someone lifting their wrist while the e-stim is on your forearm lifting your wrist, or make sure you're watching your wrist come up, or do it on your other hand simultaneously. Those would all be examples of mental imagery. Visualize yourself lifting your wrist, reaching for a cup, holding that cup up, taking a drink while that e-stim is on, or watch someone on a video doing that with their wrist lifted. Maybe visualize yourself curling your hair or brushing your hair or blow drying your hair, lifting that wrist up, or putting a ponytail holder in, which is what I'm working on with someone right now. Every time that e-stim comes on, visualize that part of putting that ponytail holder in your hand. Those would all be examples of a combination therapy that maybe we underutilize in therapy or structured therapy currently. And then the other one is arm immobilization with brain stimulation. Now, this combination of therapies would be limited to those of you that are in a facility that offers brain stimulation, but I haven't seen too many studies looking at constraint-induced movement therapy. Again, remember that's where we constrain the uninvolved side of the arm. Uninvolved arm, what does that do? This is the uninvolved arm. It inhibits the uninvolved side of the brain and gives an opportunity for the involved side of the brain to become a little bit more active. But what if we combined that with brain stimulation? And yes, they have seen more activity or that neuron sprouting on the damaged side of the brain. They have seen more of that ipsilateral axon sprouting, where you're getting neurons from the surrounding area in the same hemisphere of the brain doing what we want it to do, which is sprout new legs and take over for that damaged area. Those are two combination of therapies that they presented in this paper, which I think, based on what I've seen clinically and what kinds of therapies work clinically, is kind of a no-brainer. But us therapists and just medical professionals in general, I think we're very prone to just like working in these black and white scenarios or silos of this therapy either works or it doesn't work. This therapy either works or it doesn't work. And we give less attention to possibly doing these combination of therapies, which is where I think the direction of neuro rehab for arm rehabilitation should go. Because again, we're very limited on reactivation of the involved side of the brain when someone has little to no arm movement. But what do I think this also means? Which kind of seems like a no-brainer to me. Why aren't we doing this with people that have more movement? So constraint-induced movement therapy is really only effective if someone has adequate volitional movement in the involved arm. Remember, we're constraining the uninvolved arm. Someone has to have some level of movement in the involved arm in order to be able to do task-specific training with that arm. But why aren't we doing that with brain stimulation and e-stim? Again, I'm just throwing that out there. This was not in this article. This article was really focused on what are the barriers for those people that are in those stages or have little to no arm movement. What other strategies could we potentially use to give them the opportunity of getting to that next level where they do have a little bit of volitional movement? But again, why can't we use these combination of therapies on people that are in these constraint-induced movement therapy, CIMT protocols, which is up to 6 hours a day? Is there a possibility that that could potentially be more beneficial? But then also, I love what they highlighted in this article of taking healthy individuals and kind of seeing the ramifications of what goes on in the brain when you immobilize one arm, because what that tells us is that those behavioral modifications that we make after a stroke does impact neuroplasticity. What it also means is potentially there's opportunities to do bigger scale studies with healthy individuals looking at some of these less studied treatments or therapies and doing them on a larger population, which adds a little bit of strength and validity to those studies. But that is it for this video. Again, paper is linked in the description below. Food for thought for any of you clinicians out there. So definitely I recommend reading that paper, but then also for those of you that are feeling a little discouraged or hopeless about your arm rehab, that there's constantly research going on to figure out better ways of doing arm rehab for those of you that have really plateaued, or you feel like you haven't gotten over that hump where you're getting a little bit of arm movement, but then also opportunities for all of us as clinicians of how we might be able to do these combination of therapies to help our patients kind of get over that hump. But before we leave today, one more thing, if you're new to this channel and you like this kind of video, definitely hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell. Also, if you're new, you might not know this, but we do have a membership program. So if you are someone that's plateaued or you feel like you're just not progressing as quickly as you'd like to in your neurologic recovery, I have designed a program specifically with you in mind. With your membership program, you get access to an entire vault of neuro-specific home exercises that are in a software system where you can filter down by whatever task you're trying to relearn or whatever your goals are. You can filter down to the exact exercises that address that specific movement problem. You can pull them into your own home exercise program and basically kind of build your own home exercise program. Now, for those of you that are thinking, oh my gosh, that would be way too overwhelming, I don't really know how to do that or how I would make my own home exercise program. The good news is we've also addressed that. Twice a month we meet, once for an Ask Me Anything where you can ask your specific questions. And sometimes what we do for those Ask Me Anythings is we go right into the vault and we go through someone's problem list and we kind of build an exercise program together. But then also once a month we do webinars where, again, I'm constantly looking at finding these research articles on optimizing your diet or your overall activity level or mental strategies to enhance your recovery after a neurologic injury. And the webinars kind of all focus on those types of topics. So we're really trying to hit your rehabilitation from as many angles as possible, working on all those little 1% to really upgrade your current program and get you to that next level, ultimately restoring normal movement and improving your overall quality of life. So if you want to learn more about our programs or to sign up or schedule a discovery call to speak to someone in person to see if our programs are right for you, you can visit rehab-hq.com. I enjoyed spending time with you all today, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good day.